Hey guys, it's Kevin again, my review for Gemini Man. And what Gemini Man is essentially about is we center on the character of Henry Brogan, and he is basically infamous for being one of the top assassins ever, basically the top in his generation, essentially. He has never not had a perfect shot. He's always achieved his missions in the best way possible, but you can see that he's retiring. He's at a point where he kind of wants to stop doing it because he's just grown tired of it, and it's just not something that he is as into. And basically, he starts to notice that his new target very eerily resembles him, and very quickly starts to realize that this new target that he has is actually a clone of himself. So he has to do what he can to try to neutralize this threat, but also try to figure out how this could be possible, and that's really all I'm going to say. So, Gemini Man overall, I wasn't that excited for this film. This seemed like a very generic action film to me. I do like Ang Lee as a director. I think Life of Pi is a fantastic movie, but since then, I think he's been struggling a bit. He definitely does not have the pedigree to him that I think he once did, but I was hoping that this could be a really good film. I like the cast behind it. I think the premise is actually really interesting. I just didn't really know how it was going to be, and it's about what I expected. Gemini Man is not at all a bad movie, but it's just a really generic and mediocre one that we've seen 1,000 times before. But we're just getting to right now, starting off with the cast. And that's definitely one of the better things about this movie. I think most of the cast here does do a really strong job, and definitely one of the biggest draws of this film is going to be its main lead. And I mean, just like most films, Will Smith does a fantastic job in this movie. He's easily the best thing about it. You can tell that he really is trying to make something more out of this role. Henry Brogan as a character, there's not a lot to him. We'll get to that in a little bit, but Smith does do a really good job with showing how this has affected Brogan and things like that, how he is someone that is trying to retire, you know, how he's had all of these years as an assassin and how that has very much altered him mentally and things like that. And I do think Smith does a really good job here for sure as that character. However, it's his performance as Junior that really did stick out to me. Junior's someone who he's been told that he needs to be this assassin and he needs to let all of his emotions repressed, basically. He has to do what he can to not react, and you see how that's had an effect on him and how it's taken a toll on him more and more throughout the movie, and I think Smith did a really good job playing both of these characters, especially, like I said, when he's playing younger Junior. You really don't feel that this is the same actor. I think he does a really good job with channeling both roles pretty well, and I overall was very impressed by him. It's by no means an amazing performance, but it's definitely better than I think the movie really does deserve. And even in moments where the film isn't working, Smith remains a highlight throughout. He's very charismatic, he's always fun, and he always seems like he's very much into the role, which I think is much better than this film does deserve. The rest of the cast here is very 50-50 for me. I mean, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, I always really do like, and she does do a good job here. Clive Owen, I was very hot and cold with. There are some scenes that I thought he did an okay job, and then there were some scenes where I just thought he was way too over the top, and we'll get more into that with the script and things like that, but I didn't really think he was that great here. Unfortunately, the worst performance for me was actually Benedict Wong, who I'm normally a big fan of. I just don't really think he worked here very well at all. They tried so hard to make him like a joke machine, and it just did not work here. They were getting so many one-liners. They pretty much all fell flat, and we'll get more into that with the script, but I just don't think that Wong was really that great here. He really didn't seem like he wanted to be in this film, and at times it felt like he was just here because they wanted a name, because, oh, Avengers is big, and if we attach him, then people will see it, even though they barely advertise him in the trailers, but whatever. Cast here, they're good, you know, for what they have, and they're definitely probably the best, they're definitely one of the best things about this movie. Now let's get to the directing and the writing, which I'm sad to say, the directing is one of the weakest parts of this entire film. I just don't think that Ang Lee had a very good idea of what he wanted to do here. There's not much of a style, there's not much of a feel, and it just feels like it doesn't feel like, you know, it's not like, say, Jon Favreau's directing with The Lion King, where that film legitimately doesn't feel like it has a director. It just doesn't really feel all that inspired. It feels like Ang Lee as a director that is starting to lose his touch. It doesn't really seem like he really had a good idea of what he wanted to do here, and that's very disappointing because I do think Ang Lee's a really good director, but I just don't think he has it in him anymore, and I hate saying that, but I think this film kind of proves that, and look, maybe he'll surprise me, but as of right now, I just don't think he's that great anymore, and this film very much does show that. It has a very hard time figuring out what it wants to be. There are points where the film is very fun, and it's trying to be like a, popcorn action film, and it does do a good job with that for the most part, but then the film tries to be something a lot more serious and complex, and neither of these tones really do blend all that well together, and it just makes for a very confusing watch overall, and again, it really is due to just Lee's directing here, which just isn't very strong. It also doesn't help that the script to this movie is terrible. I mean, I think regardless of if you like this film or not, the script is definitely not one of the high points. I mean, the story itself is not bad. I don't have a problem with the story. I think the story is legitimately interesting, and there are some things I do like about it, especially when it comes to, like I said, the characters of Henry and Junior. They give you the basis of what you need to know, that Henry is someone who he's trying to retire. He really wants to move on from this, and you can see how this is really starting to affect him. Meanwhile, Junior is someone who has perfected his ability to the point where he is, very quickly starting to outweigh Brogan's ability, and you can see how this is affecting him because he has to be emotionless and things like that, and I think they do a good job with that, but it's very surface level. There's really nothing that deep they dive into here, and I definitely saw potential. There's one scene especially where they're in these, they're in this tunnel when Henry initially confronts Junior, which you've seen in the trailer. That's genuinely a really interesting scene. You're wondering how this could really go down. You see that Henry doesn't want to kill Junior initially, and you're kind of wondering why, but the film doesn't really dive into it in the way that it should, and that really did disappoint me for sure, because especially with the character of Junior, I saw a lot of potential there. There are actually some legitimately good scenes between him and Clive Owen, but it really just isn't that well written, and that's mainly because of the dialogue, which is pretty much terrible throughout the entire film. Now, not the entire film, but there are a lot of lines that just really aren't delivered all that well, and look, Smith and Winstead, they do what they can to deliver it, but I just don't think the script was really all that great here. It also doesn't help that nearly every single thing in this film is explained to us in very, very grave detail. I mean, look, this is a very easy film to understand, but they act like it's the most complex thing in the world because they just needlessly go on and on about everything. There's one scene, especially when these two are initially meeting up. It just doesn't feel like natural dialogue. It feels like movie dialogue because they need to, shove these ideas down your throat. That scene in the trailer where he's like, you made a person out of another person. It's just as unnatural as it really does feel, and because of that, it did frequently take me out of the movie. I was just like, do we really need all of this exposition? It's pretty easy to understand what's going on, that his DNA was cloned, and, basically Clive Owen, cloned his DNA and things like that, and because of that, now he has the same abilities as him and all that kind of stuff, even though that it really doesn't make a lot of sense very much at all. I would not have as much of a problem if the film doesn't continually patronize you in that way, which it does quite often. It very much acts like you're dumb and you don't understand what's going on, and I've always said, like, the best way to approach stuff like that is to act like the audience is in fact smart and, try to get the audience to understand what's going on. There's a way to do that without just verbally explaining everything to us, and I just think it really didn't need to be that way. I think there was a way to approach it where they didn't have to just continually spout off exposition, and it made for probably some of the worst parts of the movie. It also doesn't help that besides Henry and Junior, the rest of the characters in this movie just aren't interesting at all. Mary Elizabeth Winstead, as much as I really do adore her as an actress, and I do like her in this movie, the film clearly has no idea what to do with her. They make it very clear many times in the film that they just have no idea what the hell to do with this character. I mean, there's a point where you think maybe she's going to get involved with Junior, maybe something's going to happen there, but the film just doesn't have any idea what to do with her. She doesn't really have have much of a character at all, and I just don't think they did a very good job with her. But easily the two characters that I just really was not a fan of. First of all, Benedict Wong, as I said, I don't think that he was really good here at all. I think that they did a really poor job in just trying to make him the comedic relief. I should also mention, most of the jokes here are completely juvenile and really feel like a first draft in that way. Like, it really seems like they just inserted jokes into here just to keep you from getting bored, and it really didn't work at all. When they're delivered by Smith, they're not as bad because Smith is such a charismatic actor, but whenever they were delivered by Benedict Wong, it really fell flat for me. There was not a single joke that he had that I laughed at. I just really thought that he was miscasted here, and I usually really do like him, but especially towards the end of the film, he feels largely inconsequential. It doesn't even really feel like he needed to be here, other than they just wanted to have some kind of comedic relief, and I don't think that really worked out at all. And then Clive Owen, again, as much as I really do like him as an actor, and I said he was very on and off for me in this movie, that's nothing compared to his character. I mean, he is the definition of just the generic villain that has this ridiculous plan and doesn't really, you know, is clearly being very disingenuous throughout the film, but the film tries to make it seem like otherwise. He's just not very well written, and so because of that, there really is no tension. It's pretty obvious what Clive Owen is doing. It's pretty obvious that he is tricking Junior into thinking that he has this love and admiration for him, when in reality he really doesn't. It's pretty clear throughout the beginning of the film, but the film acts like that's not the case, and it's just a really messy screenplay. And I think all of that really boils down to the fact that, you know, it's really due to the fact that this film did have 3 different writers, and I've said before, that's never a good sign with a film like this, and it very much seems the way. There's a huge clash of ideas here, and the script just isn't very well thought out. There are things that are definitely interesting, and I appreciated some of the stuff they tried to do, but overall, I just don't think it's a very strong script at all, and I think that's the main thing that really does hurt this film. The cinematography here, that's going to be a big worry of people going into it, is the de-aging, and I will say, for the most part, it is actually really damn good here. There are some scenes especially where you forget that Junior is also played by Will Smith. You forget that. You forget that this isn't a different actor. That's how real he really does feel. There's one scene especially with him crying to Clive Owen, and it just felt so real in that way. Like, you felt like it felt so tangible, and I think they did such a great job with that. So for the most part, the de-aging here is pretty remarkable until we get to one scene towards the end of the movie where I don't know what the fuck happened, but they just shit the bed completely with this last scene. I mean, it's so bad. I don't know what happened, but aside from that, the de-aging is actually really good, aside from that one scene where it's pretty much laughable, and I don't think they did a good job with that at all. But the one thing I will very much caution you about going into this movie, a lot of people are going to be intrigued by this high frame rate fiasco, and I'll just tell you right now, it is definitely not worth seeing. I, myself, was intrigued by this. I wanted to see how this could really, you know, how this could really turn out. Ang Lee said this was the way to see the film, and I'll just tell you right now, this is not the way to see the film. I mean, if you want every single scene in this movie to look like a cheap Doctor Who episode, then go for it, but it's completely distracting. It doesn't really add much of anything, and I feel like the only reason Ang Lee did this is because he wanted to promote some kind of buzz for the movie, because he had no idea how else to market it, so he just decided that he'd do this, which I don't really understand, because he did with Billy Lindslow on Halftime Walk a couple years ago, and people didn't like that anyway, but regardless, it's not worth seeing, so don't do that. But aside from that, I will say, there are some really good action sequences in this film. The motorcycle chase that everyone's talked about is legitimately very thrilling. There's a shootout sequence towards the end that I thought was pretty thrilling, but again, watching it in 120 frames per second very much took me out of the film. I didn't really feel like the scope was as well utilized as it could have been. I think it looks a lot better shot on film, but I still was able to recognize that that's probably a really cool scene, and I do think that it was legitimately thrilling, despite the fact that it looked like a TV show. So yeah, that is the one thing I will say. If you're gonna see it for that, it's not even worth it, so don't even bother. The score here is fine, I guess. Not really much to it. And the editing. This film is very inconsistent in many areas, as I said, but especially when it comes to the pacing. The first half of this film, like before we get to him knowing of Junior's existence, is it is glacially slow. I mean, like, it is so slow paced, and I was honestly getting really bored at like the first like 40 or so minutes of this movie. It takes a long time for Junior to get in there, and I don't really understand why. I don't know why we need to spend all this time building up to it, because once we do, the film is then suddenly like chugging at like 90 miles per hour. Like, it is so fast paced once we initially meet Junior, and again, I think it's really just due to the fact there just wasn't much of a vision here. So ultimately, Gemini Man, it isn't necessarily a bad film, but it just isn't one that I think is really worth seeing at all. Will Smith does do the best he can to carry it. The de-aging here is pretty much remarkable throughout, minus that one scene where it kind of looks like shit. There are some clever ideas here and there. I do think Mary Elizabeth Winstead did the best that she could, but overall, this is a film that just feels very messy. It doesn't really feel like it had a very good idea of what it wanted to be, and just ultimately, I think really does show that Ang Lee is starting to fade out as a director, and I hate saying that because I do think he is very talented, but if this film's any indication, I just don't really think he's got it in him that much anymore. I don't think there's a lot to marvel about when it comes to this film, and I just think overall it really could have been something a lot better, but unfortunately just really ends up being largely unremarkable and something that I'm probably going to forget the second I'm done with this review, and I am going to give Gemini Man overall a C. But overall, guys, in my review of Gemini Man, let me know what you guys saw this one overall, leave your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.